thank you for being here. My name is Anna Abraham, and I'm the director of the Torrance Center for Creativity and Talent Development at UGA. And I welcome you all very warmly to our 2022 annual Torrance Lecture. It's kind of fabulous to be able to host this flagship event in this gorgeous venue, Georgia Museum of Art. And we've had a super stimulating day of events all day long today. In our mini conference, our 4 brilliant lectures on the power of narratives across disciplines. And we wrap up this focus on narratives this evening, with an absolute treat, a lecture by Professor Angus Fletcher, who's a world-renowned expert on narratives and the capacity of narratives to transform our minds and, through it, our action in the world, in actions in the world we inhabit. Angus is currently based at Ohio State University. I've been told to say it is the Ohio State University. From what I can tell, he serves in at least 3 capacities. So he's a professor in the Department of English, as well as in the Film Studies program. And importantly, for our purposes here, he is a professor of story science in the world's foremost academic think tank for the study of stories and how stories work. So, owing to his expertise in narrative innovation, Angus has worked for over a decade as a consultant for film and television producers at a range of different places: Disney, Sony, the BBC, Amazon, Universal, and PBS. He's the author-presenter of the Audible Great courses, Guide to Screenwriting, and The Art of Story. He's been awarded numerous research grants from the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and the New York Academy of Medicine, to name some. He has several publications to his name, including 3 books: Comic Democracies from Ancient Athens to the American Republic, which was published in 2016. Rethinking, a field guide to building your strategic core, published in 2021. And Wonderworks, Literary Invention and the Science of Stories, also published in 2021. He's currently working on another book, which is under contract, I believe, with Columbia University Press, and it is titled Storythinking. So we have that to look forward to very soon. And as though that isn't enough productivity for one person in one lifetime, Angus is also the author of more than a dozen feature screenplays and television pilots that he's not going to tell us anything about, sadly, today, I imagine. So I first came across Angus's work in his 2021 book, Wonderworks, which, fittingly enough, is kind of a work of wonder. If you haven't read it yet, you really should. It's an intriguing, magical read. And it's among the few that I know of that make a convincing case for viewing literature as a technology of sorts. A technology with the potency to help us understand not only others, but also ourselves better. And what's more, a technology with the potential to help us improve ourselves, to become better people, and to reach our inherent creative potential. I have to say that I was kind of very struck by this book when I read it, and it's kind of stayed with me, and I've kind of wondered why that is. I first thought it was because I've always been an eager lover of stories. And here was this incredible resource, explaining the magical power of stories. A beautiful story about stories, as it were. And then I read some more of Angus's work. His innovative academic research on creativity, his bold views on artificial intelligence. And I think there is a second reason why his work has kind of lingered in my thoughts. And it's because, for the first time in decades, I think, it feels to me like someone is capturing something essential to creativity that has been ignored in research, the quintessentially human component, our penchant for storytelling and story receiving. Creativity has for a long time had to strive with the shadows of giants, beginning with the giants of the past, intelligence testing and problem-solving, based approaches, to the giants of the present, neuroscience, computational and human capital-based approaches. In Angus's work, creativity breaks free from some pretty constraining and often warped notions. And I think his work has the potential to help guide the field to its rightful place, because his work recognizes that creativity is a fundamental human capacity that can be honed and cultivated, because it is a capacity that derives from spontaneously emerging skills: our desire to play, our desire to communicate, our desire to understand, our desire to evoke considerations in others, our desire to impress, our desire to effect change, our desire for storytelling. Stories capture our individuality, our unique perspectives on the world. To Angus, they hold the key to human creativity. and he will tell us how. We are honored and deeply grateful that Professor Angus Fletcher, a rare academic who engages in genuine, concerted interdisciplinarity, accepted this invitation to deliver the 2022 annual Torrance lecture, and we warmly welcome him to deliver his address on the topic, Why Are Children More Creative than Computer AI? Until we go to school.
Thank you. I'm not going to live up to that introduction, I want to warn you now. I will do my best, and I want to thank you for inviting me here, and this is a quintessentially creative choice to invite me because I am not a creativity researcher. I am really a narrative researcher, and I came into creativity studies about a year ago, kind of at a sort of strange sideways trajectory, and so a lot of the things I say may be nuts, and I hope not too offensive, but I hope by presenting some different ideas that it will stimulate you to see some more possibilities than I think are currently being realized in the way we talk about creativity now. So I'm here to talk about what I think is honestly the existential problem of our times, which is children and their education. And I want to start with the fact that my mind was blown in a bad way about a year ago when I learned a stunning fact, which is that children get less creative in school. And the longer they stay in school, the less creative they get. And this is a problem that starts when they're about 7 or 8 years old, and it continues all the way through. It continues in fields even like design and engineering and art that are supposed to promote creative problem solving. We know that by the time you get a PhD in engineering, you are significantly less creative than you were when you were 4 years old. And this isn't my research that has pointed this out. That, however, was not what blew my mind. What blew my mind is that we have known this for over 30 years. Everyone knows this, and no one has stopped it from happening. And we are continuing to put children into a school system that we know is making them less creative. And so about a year ago, when I discovered this, I wanted to know why. Why is this happening? Why is this going on? So the first thing that I discovered is a lot of people are not particularly concerned by this phenomenon. When I brought this up to various people who shall remain nameless, the first thing I heard was, well, you know, creativity is all about like finger painting and making arty type things. And, you know, that's not really what school is for. School is for serious things. And then related to that, I heard, well, you know, as you get older, you get more mature and you realize the reality of life and the hard facts and truths. And truths and facts aren't subject to creativity. You can't meld them or twist them. You just have to accept them and go with them. So the reason these are bad rationalizations is because creativity, although creativity is important to the arts, and as someone who spends most of his time in the arts, I think the arts are very, very important to humans, but it's not just about the arts. Creativity is any solving of a new problem. It is any going back to an old problem and coming up with a better solution to that problem. It is the basis of new medicine, of COVID vaccines. It's the basis of new technology. It's the basis of new business. It's the basis of new leaders. Don't we need new leaders in our world? Don't we need creative people who can come up with new ways to bring us together and find solutions to the problems that we all see around us? That's what creativity is, and that's what we're taking away from kids when we put them into school. They become less likely to invent new medicine, less likely to come up with new science, less likely to become dynamic new leaders, less likely to do any of these extraordinary things. And perhaps, most importantly from their perspective, creativity is an enormous source of resilience. If you have confidence in your ability to come up with answers to problems, that means that when you confront a problem, you're not scared by it. You're not broken by it. You see it as an opportunity. And we can directly track the decrease in creativity in kids with the decrease in their resilience. Our kids now are struggling in schools, and they're struggling with a lot of problems such as anxiety, anger, asking for help, giving up, turning to adult authority, that are all driven at the root by a loss of creativity. Because if you don't have the ability to come up with a new answer, then when you hear something hard, it makes you scared, it makes you anxious, or it makes you panic, it makes you aggressive, it makes you angry. We're seeing all these fights on the playground. This is a fight or flight response that is coming out because we're not allowing our kids to develop their natural sense of creativity. So we need a more effective way to train creativity in schools. Basically, my conviction, I think this is what this all adds up to, is the sense that if we're going to put kids in school, we need to solve this problem. And so the question is how are we currently training creativity in schools now? And then I'll talk a little bit about how I think we can be doing better. How we train it now, there's two main approaches. The first is play. Now, there's nothing wrong with play. In fact, play is wonderful. Play is amazing. It's a great thing, but it's not school. And so first of all, what that means is that it's really unstructured. We're not in any way directing it as adults. We're just allowing it to occur on playgrounds and things like that. And what that also means is because it's not school, what we know is that the more we rely on play to encourage creativity, the more that kids associate play with not work. And when they associate play with not work, what they start to think is that play does not matter in the real world. Creativity does not matter in the real world. And it leads to an increase in what we call magical thinking. And so we see kids pretending to be superheroes, or playing video games, or doing all these kinds of things, which again are not harmful, but that's not building resilience because no superhero is coming to save you from your problems. You can't fight your way out of things like you do in a video game in real life. So play is great and it's wonderful, but it's not helping tackle this underlying problem of how do we train creativity in school. The next thing we have done, the second major thing, is we have imported a lot of creativity training which has been essentially developed in business schools or in Silicon Valley. And we're putting that into classrooms. And again, there's nothing wrong with this, but what research has shown is that what this training does is encourage small, kind of minor innovations, as opposed to major, big imagination. And so it's essentially taking what is children's gift, which is the ability to think really big outside of the structures of the society that they have inherited, outside of all the kind of problems that we have bequeathed them. It's taking that away from them and it's radically narrowing their sense of what they can do with their creativity. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about a new approach to training creativity, which I've been developing over the past year. And I've been developing it with a couple partners, the University of Chicago Booth and United States Army Special Operations. When I mention that those are my research partners, people often have a lot of sort of immediate thoughts about me and exactly what I'm doing. First of all, when I meet random people on the street, they're like, "Oh my God, that's so cool! You work with Delta Force! Are you training children to jump out of helicopters?" No, we are not actually doing that. Also, I don't really like guns and get kind of freaked out by the military. When I present in a lot of academic circles, they often think that I'm part of what I've discovered is called the military-industrial complex, and I immediately get viewed with extreme suspicion. Let me just tell you the story of how it happened. Basically, I published a book, the book that Anna was talking about earlier, Wonderworks, and basically the point of that book is to rethink the way that stories work. We're conditioned now to think of stories as something that we use to get other people to think how we want them to think. So a huge way that we think of narratives now is, how do I convince people that I'm right? So if you're in a political argument, how can I sway people with my political narratives? Or if you're a scientist, how do I get people to believe my research? And so we have this huge focus on using stories to impact other people's behavior, which to me is kind of antisocial and not really the purpose of being a human, to somehow control other people with your own master narrative. And what I talk about in the book is actually, no, the real power of story is to turn it inward on yourself And the stories that you tell yourself can increase your empathy, and they can increase your curiosity. And they can help you process grief and help you process trauma and maximize all this potential you have in your own brain. And so instead of spending all this time thinking about stories as ways to control other people, how about we see them as an opportunity to kind of grow our own minds? So that's what I talk about in the book. And to my stunned surprise, this proved popular with a segment of the business community who thought the book was amazing. And that segment of the business community were entrepreneurs. And they said, we want to tell ourselves stories that make us more creative. Can you come and train us to become more creative? And so now you see how I entered into creativity studies, really not knowing anything about it more than children's literature, which I had done a bunch of work on and how that kind of helped children make creative. So I said, oh, of course, I'll come. So I started working with these business execs, and that went well. And that led one of them to call me up one day and say, hey, Angus, how would you like to talk to the US Army? I said, what have I done? They're like, no. The US Army would like to learn more about creativity, which at the time I thought was a complete oxymoron. I was like, the US Army wants to become creative? What is going on? Turned out they did. Turns out the US Army places a huge premium on creativity. I started talking to the Command and General Staff College, and then I got brought in to work with US Special Operations. And basically the way that things work in our world, for better or for worse, is that when the American people have a problem, they ask the government to fix it. And when the government doesn't know how to fix it, they ask the Army to fix it. And when the Army doesn't know how to fix it, they turn to Special Operations. And so basically Special Operations gets dumped with a lot of problems the American public does not want to think about, but wants to go away. Again, for better or for worse. And so what that means is that US Special Operations has to think, how do we come up with solutions to these problems that no one else has solved? And so I started working with those groups and those teams to think about how they can uptrain their creativity. And it started by going back and rebooting the way that we currently think about creativity. So let me talk a little bit about how creativity studies works broadly. And again, this is from an outsider's perspective. So much of what I say may be biased, ignorant, and wrong. From an outsider's perspective, the origin of the field is J.P. Guilford, who was actually tasked with the US Air Force, by the US Air Force in World War II, with coming up with a way to create more creative pilots. Because the Air Force had noticed that some pilots were better than others. They were able to shoot down more planes. And of course, the Air Force being the Air Force was like, we've got to figure out how to get more of these pilots to shoot down more planes. And they decided that the reason that these pilots were more effective is because they were more dynamic and imaginative and able to adapt and react faster. And so they put J.P. Guilford on the task, and he started to work on it. He eventually retired as a colonel from the Air Force and moved to the University of Southern California, where he continued to work on this problem and sort of became the founder of modern creativity studies. And what he believed, which was a popular belief in the 1940s and 1950s, and then went away for a while, but has come back in our own time, is that the human brain can be understood entirely as a computer. And that all the smart things that went on in your brain were computational in some form. It could be reduced to Bayesian nets and logic processes and NAND, NOR gates and things like that. And so that led him to this computerized view of creativity, which has two kind of broad components. The first of which was immediately intuitive to me, and the second which took me a little bit of time to wrap my mind around. The first is that there's a whole bunch of things about creativity that are logic-based, and you can train through logic skills. So one of these is analogical thinking. So you say, if something's like this, it works in this situation, how would it work in that situation? This idea of creating analogies to give you creative ideas. And then this is also where we get design thinking from. Design thinking is an application of logic to creativity. But then the second branch is randomness. And this caused me a little bit of a kind of brain hitch at first, because I was like, computers and random, what? But if anyone here works with computers, as I imagine some of you do, you'll know the computers, because they are so logical, can also be completely random, incredibly random, much more random than computers, than humans. And that's why computers are used in cryptography and things like that. They have the ability to generate vast amounts of random numbers. If I were to ask you to come up with a list of random numbers, it would turn out to be extremely not random. And this is why when people fake data, If you've ever seen this instance of someone just kind of making up a whole bunch of statistics and then publishing it in a journal, they immediately get caught because it turns out as a human you cannot make up data. You don't have the ability to come up with the same degree of randomness that the computer has. So what that means is that when you have this computerized view of the brain, you also have this view that creativity can be random. And in that kind of randomness are two processes that you probably have heard a fair amount about: divergent thinking and then brainstorming. And almost all the work that we do, certainly in corporations and entirely in the US military when I came in, was based on these. So they would bring people in for brainstorming sessions to do divergent thinking. It's a ton of analogy-based thinking and a ton of design thinking. And it turned out it was not proving very effective. And the fact that it wasn't proving effective on human populations has been confirmed by the fact that we have now given it over to AI. So when these techniques were first developed, computers were not that advanced. They're fairly simple things. But now we have incredibly powerful computers that can run divergent thinking millions and millions of times faster than any human. They can brainstorm millions and millions of times faster than any human. So you would think that if computers can do these processes so much faster than humans, which they can, the computers would be amazingly creative, and that they were doing all sorts of extraordinary, amazing things. Turns out they're not. There's a lot of excuses that computer people have for this. I'll be happy to go through some if you want later in the talk, because I get a lot of hate from computer people. And so I've had to do a lot of public conversations, particularly in Silicon Valley, with like, oh, you're such an idiot, man. Let me tell you what you don't understand about computers. When they achieve consciousness, they're going to be able to do anything. Let me explain to you the secret in the universe. And I'd be also happy to talk through some more serious objections too, if you'd like. But the main just common sense objection is you can tell the computer is much faster than you at doing these things, and yet it's not more creative than you. What's going on? What's the deal there? And here's some examples, just to put them up for you, of computer creativity. Show that I'm not a complete computer hater. I do think computers can be creative. This is an example from GPT-3 of a computer writing poetry. Here's an example of a computer doing art. But what you see is the more you see what the computers are doing, is they're really just mix and matching stuff. So it's like they can go in and kind of make a melange of pre-existing stuff, but they can't do what a human does and make something totally new. Why? What's going on? Well, the explanation, which is a really simple explanation if you've ever met an artist, is that it's true that art is not logical, but that does not mean that art is random. Artists have a method. And this is sometimes hard for people who aren't artists to understand, because artists can sometimes seem very random. But artists over time develop their own personal sense of this is what I'm doing, and here's why I'm doing it, and here's how I'm doing it. And that's why one writer never writes like another writer. If you know a writer really well, you know her voice. She has developed her own voice. If you know a painter really well, he has developed his style. You know that style. They have developed their own personal method. It's not just random. So what's going on there? I'm going to tell you a very, very short story. This is my theory about what's going on. And then I'll move from this theory very quickly into applied practice for those of you who don't like academics and are pontificating about stuff that we weren't there to observe. So here's my theory. Let's go back a little over 500 million years ago to the origins of the neuron, the origins of this thing in our head, which we call a brain, the origins of animal life. What was going on with that neuron? What was its evolutionary function? Well, essentially, before the neuron evolved, all life really did was just kind of bob around and absorb nutrients. But what the neuron allowed life to do was seek out food. It was its kind of most basic function of life. Now that I have this neuron, I can seek out food. Well, how do I do that? Well, first, there's the evolution of the visual function. And what happens with vision is you can see the food and you can go towards it. And so we developed this certain kind of neuron, which is highly specialized, which has now become the basis of our own visual cortex, which operates through induction. And induction is the basis of symbolic logic. And what happened over time is the visual parts of our brain have become enormously empowered symbolic logic processors. And what that means is that they can give us representations of reality very, very quickly. What's another word for symbolic logic processor? It's a computer. We're running a huge computer at the back of our brain, which is based in vision. And parts of those neural mechanics have propagated forward into other parts of our brain and allow us to do things like math and logic puzzles and things like that. So that's where all these kinds of computational parts come from. And what that tells us is that our brain is partly a computer. But then there was another thing that happened, which is that as animals in the sea developed the ability to see food and go after it, some of those animals started to eat some of the other animals because they saw them as food. And so if you're one of those other animals who was getting eaten, you had this problem, which is that you were being eaten. And you had to figure out, how do I get away? You had to develop new actions. You had to be able to create evasive maneuvers. You had to be able to improvise a way to move that wasn't being expected by the thing that was coming to eat you. And that developed another neural mechanic, which went on not to have symbolic logic as its basic mechanical process, but instead what I would call technically narrative cognition, but we can also just think of more informally as story thinking. That's just the ability to think in a story. It's the ability to think in terms of a cause and an effect. And story thinking allows your brain to do all sorts of really interesting, extraordinary things that computers can't do. It allows you to make plans and to make plots. Plot is, of course, another word for narrative. It allows you to have strategies. It allows you to role play. And if you're interested in the kind of mechanics of how these work, I can talk about them afterwards. But basically, hopefully you appreciate all of these as basic kind of story functions. It allows you to remember sequences of events and speculate on possible future events. And it also allows for certain kinds of creativity. And the two that I'm going to focus on now, because these are the two that I have kind of trained most extensively, are diversifying causal thinking. I know that's a mouthful. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And sharpening counterfactual thinking. What do I mean by that? Well, causal thinking is thinking, why? Why did this happen? Why could this have happened? You notice that this is one of the first questions that children ask. Children are aggressive causal thinkers. Why? They're searching for the hidden cause of life. Because if you know a cause, you can create an effect. And in a cause and an effect together, that's a narrative. That's a story. That's an event. That's an action. That's a happening. And so if we can diversify our causal thinking, which is to say we can come up with more causes, then we can create more things. So what is a toolbox if you're a workman? A toolbox is simply a bunch of causes. It's a hammer. It's a saw. They allow you to create more things because a hammer can cause different effects than a saw. And the more tools you put in that kit, the more things you can create. And so it is with your brain. The more causes, the more tools you can put in your brain, the more you can create. So that's one of the ways that we can increase creativity, is by just increasing the number of causes that we have in our head. And then there's sharpening counterfactual thinking. What do I mean by that? Well, counterfactual thinking is the origins of fantasy, fiction, all these kinds of things. Because what happens in counterfactual thinking is you change some element of reality, and then you play a thought experiment. What would happen? What would happen if humans could fly? What would happen if we could just do photosynthesis? What would happen if we invented carbon capture? What would happen? What would happen? What would happen? The important thing about sharpening counterfactual thinking is instead of going full-blown fantasy and changing 800 things about the world and making a complicated magical system, you say, what one thing can I change? And what will the effect of that one thing be in 15 seconds? And then in 30 seconds, and then in a minute, and then in 2 minutes, and then 5 minutes. And you see, you really get precise about it. And this leads you to ask questions like, what's the smallest change I can make now that I know will have the biggest effect in the future? And the reason that this is so empowering for kids is that kids oftentimes just jump immediately into magical thinking. And they immediately say, oh, I want to change everything. And I want to do it by giving myself a wand. You know what I mean? Or by having that. You say, no, slow it down. And then see every little step in the chain. And it's the same thing. I work on this a lot with my college students. You know, a lot of my college students will come to me and they'll say, I want to be a famous Hollywood screenwriter. I would say, okay, well, what's your next step? They'd be like, I don't know. And I'd say, all right, well, let's slow down the story. What's the smallest change you can make now? Where does that change lead you? Where does that lead? And then how do we get you all the way to being a famous Hollywood screenwriter? So if you're interested in some of these exercises for adults, because I see I don't have that many 3rd and 4th graders in the audience right now. So if you're interested in some of these exercises for yourself, you can check out the stuff that I published this year in the New York Academy of Sciences and Harvard Business Review. What I'm going to talk about now is a study that I did this summer at a local area elementary school. And I'm just going to present the preliminary data. We put this out for peer review. It has not been published yet. And I'd just be interested in your thoughts on the experiment design, because I'm not someone who normally runs experiments on 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. And really, I did it out of a sense of just my own curiosity, in the sense that I was there and I could get funding to do it. And I just kind of wanted to see what happened. And so we took the same training that we were developing for these US Army special operators in terms of counterfactual thinking and causal thinking, and we just gave it to 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. And our idea was, can we see the effect of this on their resilience? Do they become more effective at solving their own problems? Do we see less anxiety and less anger and less turning to adults for help? And I'm going to be honest, the camp, at least for the first few days we were running this summer, radically increased my own anxiety and my own propensity to anger, because I am not good at managing 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. I actually almost had a complete heart attack about 2 weeks before the camp, because it was my son's birthday, and he's in 2nd grade, and so he invited all his friends over to the house. And for 5 minutes, I was in charge of, I think, no more than about 8 or 9 2nd graders. And I experienced what they call in the Army a catastrophic loss of control within about 3 seconds. I mean, I just thought one of them was going to die. It was so much chaos. They were like running places, throwing themselves, and all this kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh my goodness, I'm now in charge of 35 of these, you know? What is going to happen for 2 weeks? But it went fine because we had experienced teachers. I'm sure you know some of them. I was basically just put on the side with the notepad. I just took notes. So it went totally fine. Here's an example of one of the exercises we use to to diversify their causal thinking. We did a lot of these 2-act problems. And in the 2-act problem, we would first present them with the character who wanted to do something, and then we would present them with something that stopped them from doing it. So in this case, we would say, Lucy wants to build a sandcastle, and then we'd say, oh no, but it has rained. It's starting to rain. What should she do? What should she do? And we discovered in the control group that before they had the training, they gave answers such as cry. She should cry. I was like, okay, all right. It's not a bad answer, but it's not, you know. We had a kind of a, what I would call a sort of anger response. And so anger responses are when you just have to do it, and you just try and impose your will on the situation is essentially where the beginnings of anger are. And so we had a bunch of students say things like, well, you know, I would just make like a giant umbrella out of my body to protect the sandcastle or something like that. And then we also had magical thinking. We had people saying things, I would pray to God to make it stop raining. We had these kinds of answers were very common. But then we walked them through the causal thinking process, and we would say, what's the character's deep why? What's their deep motivation for wanting to build a sandcastle in the first place? And so 3 of the answers that we got, these are just typical answers, are Lucy's building it because it's enjoyable to build things. She's building it because she wanted to shape something with her hands. And my favorite one, she's building it because you get to destroy what you make, which I think is the most amazing reason ever for building a sandcastle. So we then say, okay, given those reasons, what ways could you find to get the same effect now that it's raining outside? And so you can see the same answers. You can see the answers. You can see that if she was doing it to build things, that she could just build something with blocks inside. If she was doing it because she wanted to shape with her hands, she could go mold some clay. If she was doing it because she wanted to destroy what she made, she could bake a cake and then eat it with her fingers, which I think you can predict was the response that the class voted for. So hopefully that makes sense. This is how we kind of translated. This is a special forces exercise we use all the time, but here we're using it for elementary students. How do we sharpen counterfactual thinking? We had a lot of different techniques. This was one of the most effective. It was to do a group choose your own adventure. And so first of all, we carefully selected these choose your own adventures that did not have bad or negative endings. I was surprised when I started ordering all these choose your own adventures for middle schoolers and elementary students, how many of them are meant to educate children about bad decisions. And so you would choose something and it would be like, now you're dead, now your family hates you, you've lost your arms. I was like, okay, this is more intense. And we chose books that were totally open-ended. So every choice worked, it just works in a different way. And then we would read the story to the class, and then we would arrive at a branch point, a choice point, and we would say, who wants to go left and who wants to go right? And some of the kids would go left and some of the kids would go right, and they go into two different groups. And then we'd go over to one of the groups and we'd continue reading aloud so everyone could hear, and then we'd read the next part of the story and say, who wants to go up and who wants to go down? And then they would split again into another group, and we'd go back to this group, they'd split up. And the more we went into the story, the more the students kept splitting up and splitting up and splitting up until often they were the only person on their path. And what we would say the whole time we were doing this is see how many different choices there are. See how many alternate possibilities there are, and see how none of them are wrong. Because when we first started this exercise, the kids would be very convinced that one of them was right. And a lot of times when we asked them to kind of explain their answers, they would do so in a way that was explaining why the other answer was wrong. We noticed this a lot. But then the more we kind of did it, the more they'd be like, oh, here's why I'm doing it, here's why I'm doing it. And then they got better at saying, well, here's why James was doing it, or here's why Sharice was doing it, or whatever, you know? And they started to kind of live essentially in multiple futures. And this is another exercise we teach the special forces guys, where we say, don't live now, live in multiple futures. Because if you live in multiple futures, you're always more flexible and able to adapt to whatever present happens to arrive. And then once we did this, we then asked them to bring in one of their own favorite stories, and we asked them to change it. So what could have gone differently? Make your own counterfactual intervention. And when we did this in the control group, what we found is the kids were like, well, you shouldn't change the story because it's already a good story, you know? But when we did it with the narrative group, they got very excited. And there were a lot of good ones. One of my favorite ones was the Harry Potter one, where one of the students was like, I'm going to change it so that Harry Potter doesn't go to school. I was like, oh, okay, what happens then? And they're like, well, you never learn anything really cool in school. So I bet that Harry Potter would have invented his own kind of magic, totally different. And you can see where that went. Here's a little more of a real world one with Curious George, where our student said, what if the man in the yellow hat actually asked Curious George why he was so curious? Because then the man with the yellow hat might actually figure out what Curious George was going to do before Curious George kept creating these problems. And when the student said this, I asked them, well, wouldn't that make the stories less funny? I said to the student, and the student gave me this look, and she goes, it doesn't look to me like Curious George is having a very fun time when everyone is angry at him. He looks scared. And I was like, good point. So that's an example, and you can do this with any book, obviously. Here's some of the outcomes we got, just to kind of summarize them really quickly. Here's a charming one actually from a student who turned out to be a second grader whose mom dropped her off in our third grade group and then ran away, as I discovered sometimes happens with public summer camps. So this student came in. She was really down the first few days of camp. And I was like, what's the problem? And she's like, I'm just so sad because my parents won't let me go to astronaut camp. And I was like, oh yeah, that does seem like a real problem, that your parents won't let you go to astronaut camp. Can you go to astronaut camp in second grade? I don't know. So what we did is we sat her down, and after we'd done a bunch of these counterfactual and causal thinking exercises, we ran her through it on her own with her own problem, and you can see her answers. We got her to think, why do I want to be an astronaut? Because I want to float. And then she realized that fish float, so I could float too if I was in the water, and I could float in the water if I learned to take swimming lessons. And this seems like a kind of a minor thing, but she went home and she asked her parents, can I enroll in swimming lessons? And they said, yes, you can enroll in swimming lessons. And she was happy for the rest of the camp. And they reported that she had stopped asking to go to astronaut school. And you see how simple that is? But it's a creative answer to her problem, and she came up with it herself just by doing this. Here's a kind of larger result that we ran on the students. We presented them with a lot of what we were told by educators were common problems that they experienced at their age group. And so one of these problems is this kind of peer pressure thing, where the other kids kind of gang up. And so we had this question about what would you do if you wanted to go swimming with your friends, but they told you your swimsuit look dumb. And in the control group, we got kind of classic give up or anger responses. And then in the narrative group, you get more creative answers. And what's interesting about these more creative answers is that they don't come with a loss of utility. Or in other words, they're answers that could actually work. And so they're not about going into magical thinking. They're actually about solving your own problem. And when you feel like you can solve your own problem in these ways, even though they're basic, it just increases your levels of resilience because you just feel like, okay, I'm in command. I have the answers in myself. And this is the final piece of data I'll present. It was the most interesting to me. At the end of the camp, we did what we called a resilience test. And we would ask the kids to give us one of their own problems, something that they were really struggling with. And we would ask them to give us an answer to it. And then when they gave us the answer, we would do something really mean. We said, that answer didn't work. And they would explain to them why it didn't work. And when we had done the same exercise at the beginning of camp, the kids had all given up. We did it at the end of camp, none of them gave up. And in fact, on their second answer, their creativity scores increased. And that was a really significant thing that I felt, was what the kids were doing is they were going deeper and trying harder to use these methods, and it was resulting in more imaginative answers. And you can see one of those answers on the screen right there, which I love, this problem of waking up with nightmares and rewriting my nightmare when I wake up and calling all the things in Monster Town and so on and so forth. And again, it worked. So, this is the question that I started by posing. I hope that my answer to it is clear. My answer to it is the reason that the children are more creative than AI is because they're able to run this brain process, story thinking, narrative cognition, that computers just can't run. That doesn't make computers dumb or useless. It just means computers are really, really, really good at one kind of intelligent activity that doesn't comprehend the full intelligence of humans. And the reason that it goes away when we send kids to school is because we have created schools that are increasingly focused on training computational tasks. And in fact, in my school district, about 95% of what kids are assessed on is a computational task. Could you memorize something and remember it? Could you give me a multiple choice answer? Could you interpret something? Could you use critical thinking? Could you do math? All these kinds of things. These are all versions of computational tasks. Nothing wrong with that, but when it's 95% of the curriculum, you see how it's really building up one part of the brain and not doing anything for the other part of the brain, which I think should excite us, because it means that there is a huge new curriculum out there for us to create. So that's my talk. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to field them. If I've... Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Have you looked at any of the philosophy for children research or work?
Giving philosophy to children.
No, it's called philosophy for children. So there's a British and European approach. The one I'm thinking of is and I'm not going to think of his name off the top of my head. He was at Mount Holyoke. But they use children's storybooks with elementary school children. And it's very similar to what you're talking about here. And they have some research on it that they've done, and it was exactly that they were using it in Springfield, Massachusetts, with students from low income. Fighting went down because the students would start talking through.
Interesting.
When you do this, I feel like maybe we could, and started to really kind of be able to kind of change the narrative of it in a certain sense, in a way that might kind of really fits with what you were just talking about.
I mean, what's interesting about this is I remember, the military, being the military, branded this as the first new theory of creativity since World War II. And what I was at pains to point out to them is, in fact, no, many people have done this before. There's a researcher that I have only recently become aware of, Anna Kraft, who was at Harvard for a while, and she did possibility thinking, which is a lot of it was sort of, I mean, it wasn't based in some of the same neuroscience, but it was basically the same training. Dewey talks all about the importance of story for kids. And in fact, if you look at his original definition of critical thinking, a lot of it's really story-based and not what it's kind of become now.
Well, that's kind of what they were doing. They weren't thinking about creativity so much, but more kind of reasons, more causality.
Yeah.
But when you're already working with children's books, the creativity is kind of there.
Yeah.
And so I think they were thinking more about the causation. Why is he doing this? What would happen if he did this other thing? They were thinking more the cause and effect. But I think when you're starting with children's books, you can't separate them.
No, I agree. And the important thing I want to say is that we're interested in this kind of multiplicity of causality, which I think sometimes people, potentially if you're doing a kind of rigorous philosophy approach might clash with some of your ideas. The idea that there are actually multiple causal ways for a situation to be explained that are equally valid. And the reason that's important with kids is that they're not focused on this is the right cause. It's always like, okay, then I'll move on to the next one, I'll move on to the next one, I'll move on to the next one. And this comes out of this just special operations mindset that no one is ever right. That if you're in a situation, and if you want, I can give you some of the literal special operations problems that we deal with. They're pretty intense, but if you guys are interested, I could share you the kind of problems that these guys confront. But there's never a right answer in them. There's just always, let me try something else that's going to perhaps work. And it's that just kind of like that problem-solving psychology. And I was just very impressed by the fact that these individuals that we were meeting in special forces were just very resilient. And they were just very calm in a lot of these very difficult situations, and they were able to act faster than other people. And I just thought, if these guys figure out how to do this, I would like to at least make that available to kids, so they're not just focused on right and wrong, but can adapt. Yeah.
So towards the beginning of your thing, it was a wonderful talk. Towards the beginning of the talk, you dismissed play as an option, and the main, if I understand it right, concern was that play exists outside of the formal school setting, and so it's seen as something that's purely leisure activity. So what would, how do you feel about, it wasn't clear whether you reject incorporating play into the curriculum. You were using more narrative modes, but there have been a lot of people who have incorporated play in this way, and you could develop role-playing games that do exactly, build exactly the two strategies that you're talking about, incorporate them in a more embodied way. Is that something that you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Yeah, no, and just to be clear, I was using play there in the sense that it was being used in the school districts. You know what I mean? And they say, oh, we make time for play. When you add, so there's a lot of really interesting theoretical work that just does not translate to elementary education. So I think we can all agree that like improv games and things like that seem relatively straightforward. And then when you watch them being taught in an elementary school, they are just not taught because the teachers, for the most part, except for maybe one or two teachers, just don't really understand how to run them. And a big part of that is because they require a certain kind of almost wisdom on the part of the person implementing them to kind of know. And it's like a role-playing game. If you've ever done a role-playing game, you need someone who's your dungeon master or whatever, who has a big imagination and who's able to kind of go with things. And if you have someone who just needs to follow a script, it very rapidly does not become a role-playing game and it becomes very tight and narrow. And so what we were trying to do with these exercises was give very specific instructions to teachers that they could follow, that was helping grow counterfactual and causal thinking, but wasn't making the space so big that it became unstructured. And what we just saw is that when they were trying to incorporate play in the way you might in an MFA theater classroom, it wasn't really successful, and so play basically just became an activity for the playground, where kids would run around and invent games. For example, the kids at our thing invented a game called Hole, H-O-L-E, and the purpose of Hole was that one of the students was the hole, and then everyone else was trying to fall down the hole. And this basically, as far as I could tell, consisted of all the students climbing on top of the other students and yelling hole. But anyway, you see what I mean? And of course, that's like a wonderful activity, but the extent to which that's helping them solve problems in their real life is unclear. Yeah.
Have you had a chance to look at Torrance measures of creativity and how they relate to your narrative thinking?
So we're going to do a neuroimaging study on this. The Torrance is fascinating because the Torrance merges together computational things with narrative things, but it kind of treats them as though they were all computational. For example, alternate uses task is really a much more narrative skill because you're having to kind of come up with cause and effect and things like that. And so part of what I think is actually, there's a lot of great stuff in creativity studies that has been a little bit hampered by the theoretical paradigm that seems to have come out of Guilford, and there's a lot of interesting things that could be pulled out, like alternate uses tests and whatnot, and like Anna Craft's work, and kind of being given like a different kind of psychological basis and then kind of diversified and increased. But we have not ourselves run the Torrance test. We're going to try, by putting people in the brain scanner, to kind of focus them on, do a semantic association task. Now do an alternate uses task, and see if we can kind of identify whether it is in fact more of the motor regions that are lighting up in certain places as opposed to more of the visual regions.
So has neurological studies transcended the Torrance's effort to make creativity important to education by creating measures? I think he was constrained by that because he had come up with that test or measures. But are you saying we're on a whole new?
I don't think we're on a whole new path. Not just because I'm a Torrance speaker, I do have to give a lot of deference to Torrance because I think he was really brilliant. I think you're right, though, to go back to your earlier point. One of the real problems that we have in schools now is we're so obsessed with assessments that we're not open to allowing the teaching of things which cannot be automatically and easily assessed, at least now. And this has created this real narrowing where we're only teaching things that we know can be assessed. And a lot of those things just bias towards highly logical skills, which can be mass done through, multiple choice and kind of AI and stuff. And what's interesting to me about the Torrance test is it actually offers some very clever ways of looking at things which aren't really that accessible, but it does kind of put them in these interesting accessible ways. I think it's really smart. I do think we're going to be able to have more effective tests in the future of creativity, but ultimately at the end of the day, the whole point of creativity is that nobody knows. And this is something that I think frightens schools. But if something is really creative, you just don't know. And you have to try it. And that's why in theater, you have rehearsals. You see what works. That's why comics will often run out jokes, not before a public audience, but a kind of smaller kind of test trial. That's why scientists blow up a lot of things, because you don't know if it's going to work or not. So I think on a certain level, we have to be comfortable with the fact that there is no way to assess something creative until it is tried in a real-world situation with either an audience or the laws of nature. So there's always going to be a limit on these assessments, I think.
There's a question like that, then I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Fletcher. I'm a student, PhD student in art education, and I need your help. So, if I wish my students or I to creatively transgress, do I pursue a deeper study of philosophy, which describes, introspections, the spiritual or art thinking, or basically the big picture, or do I pursue psychology, which is more on the science thinking, which talks about the unit, something similar to what you presented, or sociology, which is basically interpreting history, or reflecting from experience. I'm asking this because I acknowledge that creativity itself is divergent in definition. It can be scientific, algorithmic, aerospace, or reflective. And though I know it intersects philosophical, scientific, or thinking historically, from which vantage point can it stand in the pursuit of meaningful creativity?
That's a totally brilliant question. So first of all, as an interdisciplinary person and at an interdisciplinary venue, I feel I have to say all of those are correct, and you should pursue all of them, and I think that's really the right answer. I know you don't have time, I know. And I think I should also be honest. I spent a lot of time bashing AI. I'm the CEO of an AI startup. I work a lot in AI. Even though I have negative views of it as replacing humans, I still think it's worthwhile to know about it. I have an MA in philosophy, even though I'm more an empiricist. My own bias is that most knowledge comes from practice, and that the further you get from practice, the more you have a tendency towards magical thinking. And I think sometimes we think that philosophy is like big ideas and practice is small ideas, but in my experience, some of the biggest ideas come out of practice. It's just that you don't know that they're a big idea because you can't put them in the context. And a lot of the most radical, innovative teachers have just been working in a small classroom and have come up with groundbreaking ideas. And they didn't know it was a groundbreaking idea because to them it was just intuitive. So My main piece of advice is if you're going to be an educator, listen to your students. Listen to what their needs are. They're really smart. I mean, you know, third graders, fourth graders, they're really, really smart. They don't always know what they need, but they can immediately tell you what they don't need. And they're usually pretty accurate about that, you know? And if you build that relationship where you see them growing under your care, that's the kind of lab space, I would say, more than anything else. And whatever level you're teaching, you know, that would be my advice. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
I was imagining this, like, when you were talking about, you know, role-playing games, basically, and having how cool it would be to have these, like, different groups of kids, and there is, like, a dungeon master, but it could be for, like, even just a real-world problem, like, oh my god, our submarine has a hole in it, what are we going to do? And then I thought, you know, because I'm stepping into teacher training more, and what I've been kind of learning is that, you know, the teachers don't know how to guide this, as you pointed out, so training them is really critical. Like, they need to have this experience as well. On top of that, the emphasis on compliance, behavioral compliance, is also very problematic. Like, that's a systemic issue of, like, the chaos that people imagine happen in a creative classroom.
Yes.
That's real.
Yeah.
It does get chaotic.
Yes.
But when teachers feel efficacy, that they can, like, navigate that.
Yes.
And I think that's also part of the teacher training. I was curious if you were thinking of doing, I mean, you guys must have kind of, as a group, decided how you were gonna approach this, which is essentially like teacher training.
Yes. Yeah, no, these are totally amazing questions, and we can talk more in specifics if you want afterwards. But first of all, yes, I mean, I immediately realized the first day we were in there with we broke the third graders up from the fourth and the fifth graders. And the fourth and the fifth graders, it was just like night and day, those two populations. And I would not have guessed that going in, but it was a very big difference. The third graders, in order to really get them to buy in, we had to do a lot of one-on-one work. We would work with them individually, and then they kind of got it, you know. But when we worked in a group, they would often sort of act up to get each other's attention and do these things, which is actually very creative, but it's creative in the short-term sense of, like, how do I achieve group dominance, things like that, as opposed to how do I solve my other problems, right? And so we had to kind of figure out how to do those kinds of things. Making students take ownership of the process, like you were saying in terms of making them a dungeon master, we would do that with the fourth and fifth graders. So we would say to them, okay, now you're kind of in charge of the rules of this world. And one of the kinds of games we would play with them is we would say, I want you to imagine a town that's exactly like our town, but there's one rule that's different. You're in charge of enforcing that rule. Okay, now we'll create a problem. Now lead your team through that problem, you know, enforcing this rule, that kind of a thing, you know. And they had a lot of fun with that. Another thing that they loved doing was writing choose your own adventures for each other. So what we would do is we would say, all right, you're going to go home this weekend, and you're going to have a lot of different things that you could do. I want you to write down all the possible things that you could have done, and we're going to create that into your choose your own adventure. So, you know, this will be Jackie's choose your own adventure. And then we're going to give Jackie's choose your own adventure to John, and John's going to take it, you know, and Jackie, you're going to do John's. And so their choose your own adventures were often they were fascinating. They're like, you know, like my mom asked me if I wanted to go to my brother's baseball game, and my choices were, I could have screamed and said, no, Mom, I hate you. I don't want to go to any more baseball games, you know. I could have got myself a book and decided to sit and read the book while I was going to the baseball game, you know. I could have told my brother that he does not actually need to play baseball because there are better uses of his time. And then he would have realized that, and we would have never had to go to another baseball game, right? And these would be like the choices. And then the kids would do it. And so that allowed them, again, to practice it where they were the authority in their own lives. And the real key there is just to keep it focused on a domain where they can be specific and not launch too fast into magical thinking, while at the same time being able to kind of see the intricacies. Because a lot of the times, like I find, like, you know, my kids are going through this thing now where the school system has this initiative, which I appreciate, which is basically trying to turn them into innovators. And so they're given a problem like, you know, we have to stop global warming or something, and then the students have to come up with it. That problem is way too big. It's like, you know what I mean? And the kids immediately just are like, I'm gonna like invent whales that like swallow, oil and stuff like that. And I'm like, that could work, but it's like, that's not something we can invent here in the next afternoon, So I think keeping it constrained, that also makes the teachers feel calmer because they feel like there are these clear boundaries on it. And as long as students are empowered, they can get really, really excited over, smaller tasks, as long as they feel it's relevant to them.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I've got a question. I'm not sure if you put it in a word, but when you were talking about frequently some of the bigger changes coming out of already someone who's highly trained, it made me think of a couple of examples of what you're talking about. The guy who invented PCR, Craig Mullis, had a visual superimposition on a pre-existing, highly trained mind, which made him think, we could do polymerase chain reactions and totally change the genetics world. And the second thing that came to mind was the Colm concerts, where you're with a certain challenge. Keith Jarrett made one of the best-selling solo jazz records in history because of the challenge of not having certain notes, certain keys, not work on the piano.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, if I can put it into words, is have you been looking at superimposition of certain externalities that also can induce creativity?
That's totally fascinating. So let me break it down into my language. And again, I want to be honest, I'm not a creativity studies researcher, and the point of this talk is not to overturn creativity studies. It's just to say that there's this other area of doing stuff. The terms that I would use for that are things like world building. So, for example, when you sit down to write a science fiction novel or something like that, if you change one way that things can work, then all of a sudden that opens up huge possibilities for everything downstream. And so in the case of PCR or something like that, you see how you could make this one change in how we're handling DNA or whatever. And then all of a sudden you see these huge possibilities. And then what you can do in that moment is you can then solve all the small problems that were attended and still are attended, honestly, on PCR, like how to actually amplify it, because you've already seen this big possibility open up and things like that. And in terms of this idea of constraints, taking away keys or something like that, one of the things we do this all the time with the Special Forces guys is we ask them to solve a plan or do a mission, and then we're like, all right, you just lost your radio, solve the mission again. And what we call that in narrative theory is, again, removing a cause, removing an action, removing a source of an effect. But there's many terms you can have for it. But yes, absolutely, and that's very powerful for groups that are highly experienced. But if you do that with a kid, they tend to freeze. Like if it's like draw that again, but I'll take away half your crayons. And so usually with kids, you have to figure out ways that they feel like they're making the choices off of the bat before you start putting on the constraints. Like you have to get them over that initial hump to have the confidence. Confidence, more than anything else, not to just blow up my own research here, but really more than anything else, confidence is the source of creativity. And a big part of what happens in school is because kids are told that there are right and wrong answers, they freeze because they think that the teacher must know the answer already, and they lose confidence, and that stops them from posing something creative. So actually, more than anything else, really, beyond any single training device, it's like, can you make kids believe in themselves? Because if you do that, most of the rest of it, their biology will take care of.
I was wondering with your Special Forces people, did you find any difference in their abilities with the ones that were multilingual as compared to?
Here's the problem. They're all multilingual. Okay. So we didn't get a chance to test that on them. It's something we could do. I'd be interested to test it on regular Army populations where they're not. But literally the first thing they do in the 18 series pipeline, for those of you who are not been brainwashed by U.S. Special Operations like I have, those are the Green Berets, and their job is to do like unconventional warfare. And so an example of one of the cool things that they did, or one of the units that I work with, is they wanted to go into Afghanistan and create schools that girls could go to. So it was their job to go into Afghanistan and figure out how do we set up an educational system where the Taliban is everywhere, where girls can go to school. And so the first task they had to do is they had to go into villages and figure out which villages would be open to this, because they didn't want to set up a girls' school that would then cause a conflict in that village, where like some of the parents would send their kids to school and then those kids would get beaten up by the other, and so they had to do all these kinds of clever and interesting things. Like they got these Wonder Woman comics in Farsi and things like that they were handing out, trying to figure out like which villages were open to them and which weren't. But they all, as part of their 18 series training, spend, I think it's either 28 or maybe even 40 weeks in a language immersion course. So, and that's before we test them.
Was that sort of like they already pre-assumed that multilingual
Yeah.
was going to make them think better?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I don't want to say too many positive things about the U.S. Army because I don't want to come across as a shill. But I will say that U.S. Army Special Operations, I was really impressed. And they do a ton of role playing and improv and theater. They have just a very different approach to things. It's not at all what I expected. They have a huge emphasis on empathy. They do a ton of empathy training. And they're just very, very curious. And they select people who they think are curious and empathetic. So I personally was just very impressed by what I found. I'm not convinced by a lot of the uses that they're put to, but I don't think that's ultimately their choice a lot of the time. So, yeah.
Yeah, can you comment on individual creativity versus team? Sometimes, as part of the problem solving, we have a team, and then as a team, of course, we would like to put the diverse group of members. But can you comment, how does the creativity varies between individual and the team setting?
Yeah. So, first of all, teams are more creative than individuals if you can get them to work properly. If you can get an inclusive, collaborative team, it's going to create more than an individual because you're just going to get more perspectives, more kind of, to use my terminology again, kind of, more narrative causes, more senses of possibility, all these kinds of things. Your brain is itself a team. There's long been a kind of myth that you have a unified thing in your head, which is you. Actually, you're running a lot of different narrative processes, which are why you're able to think from a lot of different perspectives. That's why you're able to be of two minds of something. That's why you're able to critique your own behavior. Our mind has the ability to be multiple minds. And one of the main things we train the special ops guys is to think with many minds, we call it. And to really study the people around you deeply and empathize with them deeply so that when you need them, you can call them into your mind later and think, what would they do in this situation? So teams, in a kind of ideal sense, are more effective than individuals. The problem is a lot of teams are non-functional. And you see this in a lot of places, and that's often because people in the team, they do not have the trust to just be open in the team. And they feel scared of being judged in some way, or there are other kinds of unhealthy power dynamics at play, like favoritism, or there's like a clear leader of the team who gets to decide which ideas are good and which ideas are bad, and that's just never really, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you, healthy. So if you can have a team working effectively, it's much more effective than an individual, but bad teams are way worse than individuals because bad teams tend towards a kind of group think based around what they think will build a kind of consensus that won't get them judged, and so they turn out to have much less imagination than just someone working on their own.
I wanted to ask what you think the relationship is between creativity and domain knowledge. So let's take a bridge builder, for example. Does a 30-year veteran of bridge building have more creativity about how to solve bridging problems, or does a brand new civil engineer who doesn't know the norms and rules of bridge building? Is there any relationship? Is it correlated? Is it inverse? Or is it generalizable?
It's not generalizable. And I think one of the things about creativity studies is there's been a desire to find a single relationship between the two that works in all cases. And I won't bore you with all the different opinions that people have, but what I can say is that oftentimes really big creative breakthroughs come from idiosyncratic experts. What do I mean by that? I mean an expert who thinks differently from other experts but knows as much as them. And there can be a benefit to being a new person in the room because you do have fresh ideas, but you also don't know a lot of the complications. And what that means is you kind of need to have a lucky strike. You kind of need to somehow just think of something new that actually happens to work. And usually what happens a lot of times if you're the new person is you come up with something interesting that could work, but that gets shot down by an expert, and then you give up. And then nothing comes out of it. And so usually most big breakthroughs come from people who have a different way of thinking and then have the diligence to become experts in the field and figure out all the small problems with it. And it's that combination of idiosyncrasy and expertise that you see in Tesla, you see in Marie Curie, you see in Van Gogh, you see in Shakespeare. Pick your kind of breakthrough creative. Generally, they're really, really good at what they do, but it wasn't that they became really good and then started asking questions. Usually, they kind of came in with a little bit of a quirk, a little bit of a maverick in the field, Yeah.
You organize the practice of accessing your narrative brain. In improv, we call it the improv brain.
Yeah.
And we have very specific exercises
Yeah.
to turn on our improv
Yep.
brain and get it going. Is that analogous with the narrative brain?
Yep.
Or
So-
narrative thinking?
Yep. So this is actually the first exercise we work with. We did not do this so much with the elementary students because it turns out that they were just almost always going there anyway. It wasn't really a problem. But we found this with the special operations guys. One of the first things we do is we say to them, we want you to think back to a time in your past when you successfully solved a complex open-ended problem. Think about a time in your past when something hard happened to you that there wasn't a right answer to, and you figured out how to solve it. I want you to play that story back again and again in your mind, think through all the steps. Then the next time you hit a problem, first thing you do is play back that story to yourself. That is a lot of things. It builds your confidence, and it also onboards all those processes. And one of the things we find is both helpful but also can really jam people up is reading stories about other successful people. So this is a common thing that happens when people hit a roadblock in their life is they are like, well, who in my field is successful? I should read a memoir about their life or I should seek their advice or something like that. And we find that sometimes that can be successful, but a lot of times it's not because what ends up happening is your brain is like, but I'm different from that person and they're special. And then when you are encountering problems, you're like, well, they were meant to succeed and I wasn't. Whereas if you can onboard your brain with a memory of when you yourself have been successful, and everyone in this room has done that a million times, or not a million, but thousands of times, right? We've all been successful in moments that we, at the moment it was happening, couldn't have predicted we were going to be successful, but then we just kind of forget a lot of them and we don't treasure them. And so by going back and really remembering and thinking through, oh my goodness, yeah, I did that thing. And this is really important, I feel like, as a teacher. I know everyone here who's a teacher does this a lot, but you can never do it too much, is when a student does something really impressive, mark it. You did this thing and it was amazing. The student's like, oh yeah, okay. And then you walk them back through it. You say, here's what you did, and I want you to remember that. Because that is going to be more useful to you than almost anything else you get out of this class, is the memory of when you yourself solved the problem. And so that's the most effective way to do it, that we found, is to tell yourself the story of when you yourself were unexpectedly successful in the moment when you're experiencing failure.
It may not be a good idea to ask about how to compare or what you can observe between the trainings for kids in the early years of their school and adults. I don't want to say exact like special force. They are selected based on some character traits. But I would like to understand like the school kills creativity. If you compare the training outcomes for adults after they graduate or adolescents and the kids in the early years of school, what differences you would expect in their reactions to the training? Are one group more resistant to be more creative? And also, did you tell kids that this training you would like them to be more creative in their responses? And if so, does that direction, does that instruction change the way they respond? And also, another question is that, is it stable after you measure their creativity? Is it more related to the context where they feel comfortable about responding your questions about how they will, change the story? Do you know whether it's going to be stable to some degree if you measure their creativity maybe
It goes back. It goes back, yeah. No, and this is actually one of the really important things that we found, and we put in the study. So we had an unusual thing where we trained them for 4 days, and then they had a 4-day break, and then we trained them again for 4 days. And after the 4-day break, about half the kids completely went back to what they were doing at the very beginning. And a big reason that we found out is because of parental factors. And a bunch of the parents really bought into the training and asked the kids about it, and then the kids kind of told their parents what they were doing, and then that just kind of reinforced it. This should surprise no one, that like basically being reinforced in these ways is important. Regular reinforcement is important. We find this with adults too. A big part of the way our brain works is we're social animals, and so we're always looking to what other people around us are thinking and doing. And creativity at its core takes real courage, because you got to say something that is weird, and that might immediately elicit, shock, confusion, even outrage. I mean, you can say something creative that immediately offends somebody, or that makes you look like an idiot because someone's like, well, we tried that 3 years ago, it didn't work. Oh my God, So all of these factors bias you back, and so you have to actively work to support it. As far as did we tell the kids that we were looking for them to be creative? No. What we told is that we were trying to help them solve their own problems. That was the main focus of the camp. It was basically like, we think you can solve your own problems. So what we were really looking to do was not increase their creativity as a kind of intrinsic value. We were trying to increase their resilience and self-efficacy. And that was really the kind of main thing. And as far as how it relates to adults, first of all, what I will say is that it's been my experience that kids as a group are more creative than adults as a group, but certain adults are extremely creative, and that's an interesting thing in terms of how that happens. And I don't think it is entirely based on intrinsic qualities, because when you work with a lot of very creative adults, a lot of them really do have persistence and resilience qualities, where they're actually not that creative or not that successful, and they keep trying again and again and again. So there does seem to be this core link between creativity and resilience where they kind of feed each other over time. And the core thing that we found was similar. And this is one of the reasons why we ended up launching the work on the elementary students in the first place, is when we observed the special forces guys, one of the things that would happen is we would give them a hard problem. So the way this works is we would go out into the field. I would interview working Green Berets. We would find out what were problems you actually experienced in the field. Then I would come back and I would give these problems to the trainees. If you want, do you want an example now? Would this interest you? Okay, all right. So here's a short example. I have longer ones if you want to maybe talk to me afterwards. But here's a simple example. One of these ODAs, it's a 12-person unit. It was the Ford unit at the time in Afghanistan. Their job was to help train up a local police force of about 150 or 200 police officers that was supposed to be providing security to a kind of a large town, small city area in Afghanistan. And it was their job to go in every day and kind of work with these teams of police officers and kind of help them kind of professionalize and do their job. They get a call around 6:30 in the morning. The call is, a bomb has gone off at the police station. That was all the information they got. So, jump in their rides, they drive out there. In their minds, they know what's going to happen. The police are going to be in a state of chaos, confused, panic. They've got to go down there, kind of calm them down, and sort of figure out how to kind of help them process, get the wounded out, these kinds of things. No, that's not what actually happened. They get out there, and they discover that the police are very, very angry about the bomb having gone off. And their first response has been to round up every young man within about 5 miles and put them face down in the village square and start to intimidate them by basically hitting them with rifles and things like that. So now you've got this chaotic scene where you have this smoldering police barracks, you have dead police inside, you have the living police outside, about 150 of them, with guns, yelling, assaulting people, the vast majority of whom, if not all of them, are completely innocent of anything. So you arrive in the situation, and what do you do? There's 12 of you. Well, the first thing that goes through your mind when you arrive is, this is not appropriate. My partner force is doing something which is not appropriate. I have to figure out how to get them to stop doing this. I have to de-escalate the situation and stop them and kind of clear out this place so that we can kind of, restore a sense of confidence in the police, because beyond the fact that this is a violation of due process and all these other things, now everyone in the city is going to hate the police, and all the police are going to hate everyone in the city. So this is like a total failure, So they offboard and they walk in there and they start walking up to the chief of police to try and figure out how to kind of de-escalate the situation. And then here's what happens. A mother comes running out of the crowd because her son is face down. And she comes running out of the crowd and she attacks the police officer and starts like beating him and screaming and doing all this kind of stuff. What does the chief of police do? He takes out his gun and he points it at the mom and flicks off the safety. Now, you're in charge of this ODA, this 12-person team. You're trying to process this happening. You wanted to de-escalate the situation. Instead, it's escalating rapidly. Your newest member of the team, what does he do? He takes out his gun and he points it at the chief of police, okay? So now you've just lost control of your own team, right? And then the moment that your guy points his gun at the chief of police, what do the 150 Afghan police do? They take out their guns and they point them at you. So now this is a real situation. You're standing there. The chief of police is pointing his gun at an innocent person. Your guy is pointing a gun at the chief of police, and then everyone's pointing their guns at you. If one thing happens in the next 3 or 4 seconds that is unexpected, a lot of people are just going to die. What do you do? So this is a true story. We posed this problem to young students who are coming through the pipeline and say, what do you do? And we find inevitably that they have one of 3 responses. The first is they just freeze. They just completely freeze. They're like, I don't know. That was my response, by the way, in case you were wondering. When I heard this story, I was like, oh, I don't know the slightest idea what I would do. Response 1 is to freeze. Response 2 is to basically submit to authority, by which I mean they immediately go to a rule book or they turn to you and say, what should I do, or something like that. You know what I mean? And then the third response is what they like to call Ranger Smash, but which is basically just an anger response. And the anger response is to attempt to impose your will in the situation by getting really aggressive. So they say things like, well, I'd like tear the gun out of his hand, or like, or do this kind of thing. You're like, okay, I have a feeling that would probably not have the desired response. So going back to your question, I just noticed that those 3 responses were the exact same 3 responses that the kids were doing. The kids were giving up, they were asking for adult help, or they were getting angry. And there's a narrative explanation for that in the brain. And the narrative explanation is really simple. Your brain, when it's in a creative state, sees life as a series of possible paths you could take. There's all these paths you could take. And at the beginning of each path, you could think there's a door. You could walk through that door, there's a different future. When you experience anxiety or fear, that's because your brain sees no doors. It thinks there's nothing it can do, so it just turtles, and it just feels like things are coming at it. When your brain sees one door, it gets angry. Because it's like, I gotta get through that door. That's the only way. And that's why people who are convinced that their way is right can often be so aggressive. Because they're actually not just trying to get through that door, they're trying to help get you through the door too. And they're like, this is for everybody's purpose, and we gotta get through this door. And then we find out that if we can get you to open a second door, both of those responses go down immediately. You're not afraid, you're not anxious, because you're like, oh, I got options here. And you can see that physiologically, people just calm down. That's the narrative explanation, those different paths. And so basically what we were doing with the Special Forces guys is we were to like, open another door, open another door, open another door. The more you can open another door, the more you're gonna calm down, and then the more you're gonna see more doors. And then the situation is gonna resolve itself because you're gonna have a lot of different choices. And then we did the same thing with the kids. We said to them, all you're trying to do here is not be creative, but open another door. What's another door you could open? What's another door you could open? And then we gave them all these techniques like causal thinking and counterfactual thinking to help them open doors. And that's kind of the kind of way that it worked. Yeah.
You speak about the kind of thought processes that took place in
a lot of domain-specific knowledge about a lot of domains increases your likelihood of being able to think creatively in an analogical way. A team, what kind of team do you have? Of course, that's some distributed reasoning happens in your teams, diverse teams. If you have all the team members thinking the same way, it's the same as having one person. Training the unexpected. So when I think about how to train creative thinking skills, there are things that you can focus on, which is problem solving in the moment and training up those skills. But where is the place for the more trait factors, if you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm thinking to somehow include that in your model. I mean, you're testing. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
So it's sort of like, I think, flipping out one reasoning-based approach for another sort of reasoning-based approach will have a lot of advantages to have both sides there, but we're still missing the kind of perspectives we've gotten from great educational research that shows, for instance, just having arts-based curriculums improves people's different scholastic achievement, the emotional sort of resilience and everything, just being able to have science talk to you through the arts, for instance. So where does, I'm wondering whether the reasoning-based approaches just do not accommodate for these trait-based factors that come, that are not trait-based that you're born with it, but that a lot of long exposure to
Totally. Yeah,
certain
absolutely.
kind of potential environment, a certain kind of training up that requires reading wide. This is narrative is reading the moment, but a lot of your ways of thinking come from reading a lot over a long period of time and kind of. So
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm asking.
No, I do. No, it's totally brilliant. Yeah, no.
Thinking,
Like, when are you going to play home?
yeah. I'm just wondering whether the problem that sort of the devil of the previous approach will come to the devil, not to play devil's advocate here, but
Yeah.
by not considering that there are all of these other factors that play like natural thinking, like exposure to
Totally.
not domain specificity really, but that's really important, but domain broadening as well, and where that kind of fits in. Because now we know that I completely believe that is important, but we have no real studies looking at the weightage of all of these components within a model.
No, we don't. No, absolutely no. So yeah, first of all, I'm not trying to, so as I sort of have tried to imply before, I'm also not like a Hegelian where I'm trying to like come up with the ultimate synthetic model that comprehends everything. I mean, I really am a pragmatist in the sense that I think the human brain evolved to be a multi-purpose tool, and those tools don't necessarily all distill to one tool. So I would be comfortable with the creativity studies, which is all these different things. I just want to put that out there. We're also doing a study with special forces where we see whether the classic creativity training plus the narrative training has a bigger effect substantially than either alone. And my intuition is it probably will. The idea being that because they both exist in different parts of the brain. So I think a lot of this stuff is hopefully going to amplify. The main motive for the research is obviously just the fact that what we have now just isn't working as well as we think it should work. And there has to be something, there has to be more aggressive approaches than just refining what we have. Because most of what you hear is just, well, let's just refine what we have. I think we are missing big pieces. And I think the idea here is to try and say, here's a big piece that we could try. There's probably other big pieces too, but that's the main kind of a thing here. To the other point though, which I think is totally brilliant, I totally agree with, is like, first of all, I was stunned by the huge increases that we got by using this training. And just to be totally honest, I think a huge part of that is because the baseline was so low. I don't think it was like we were suddenly turning these kids into like, major creatives. I think that because of COVID and a lot of other situations, they were really struggling. And like you, I think that there's a lot of what I would call sort of like intangible stuff, where just by reading a lot of different books, playing with a lot of different people, not necessarily in school, you develop all these creative skills, having deep conversations with friends or other experts, just spending a lot of time obsessing over things. These are all huge sources of creativity. But having said all that, we are looking at a systemic problem. We are using all this school time to train logic. We know that's not enough. It would be nice to give teachers a plug-and-play thing now that works, that makes a bad situation slightly less bad. And so that's kind of what this is. But I agree, there's a huge amount more. And at the end of the day, like I was saying before, you just never know with creativity until you try it. There's not a way to mass produce creatives. I mean, you're just never going to build a school system that just only produces creative thinkers, nor would we really want that system because, creative thinkers cause a lot of disruption, and it's a complicated balance in life, even in your own personal life. This is something we worked a lot with the Army, is we say there are times to be creative and there are times not to be creative. If you were disarming a landmine, that may not be a time to be creative. If you are fixing an airplane, that may not be a time to be creative. If you're doing a routine heart procedure, that may not be a time to be creative. And so there are these other kind of complicated factors in there. But 100% agree with everything you're saying. I was surprised by the stir that this research caused. But I do think the main reason it caused a stir is not because of the quality of the research itself, but just because I think everyone in the field feels like there is more pieces out there. And that's kind of what I hope more than anything else we kind of spend the next 10 or 15 years looking for.
I'm just wondering I feel like we're inundated with so much information, visual stimulation, and in terms of like a visual artist or even musician or many creatives, how do you feel like all of our information that we are absorbing on a daily basis is affecting our natural creativity?
Yes, in a way. So these are complicated things, but I mean, a lot of this comes down to the kind of computational structure of our culture, and a lot of the reason we're being bombarded with this information is because computers are funneling huge amounts of data towards us that they think we're going to like. And computers do not think the same way that we think. They think correlationally. They think, oh, 3 other people like this news story that you liked, so now I'm going to recommend another news story that the 3 of those people like to you, right? And so I'm going to keep bombarding you with all this stuff that is correlated, but might not, in your mind, be organically related. And that was what I was talking about when I was talking about with artists have a method. Unlike computers, which have no method in that kind of a sense, which are really just kind of doing this kind of mass pattern finding, your mind is less a pattern recognizer than a process recognizer. Your mind is good at identifying the organic why. And as an artist, you're always saying, this is why. And that's why you usually, as an artist, have a small, limited set of influences that you go back to obsessively, or a few kind of core experiences that you mine again and again and again. And so, yes, I think our culture, because it is training us to constantly be checking our phone and forgetting what our last thought was, it's not allowing us to maintain this organic, sustained growth of thought and purpose and reflection. And that's not healthy for someone who is an artist, who wants to be able to kind of grow and change in these ways. So I would definitely recommend spending less time on the internet, spending less time on those kinds of activities if you want to be an artist. Having said that, a lot of art comes from identifying what we call exceptional information. And exceptional information is something that you didn't expect to see that shifts your way of thinking. And this is why a lot of studies have shown that if you are caught in a groove of thought and then something comes in from the side and surprises you, that can be very fertile. So you do want to be open to things outside your kind of regular browsing, but you probably are getting too much of them now. And they're also, because they're being curated by computers, not necessarily as exceptional as you might if you just had more conversations with people on the streets or something like that. So I hope that answers it a little bit. But basically, yes, probably less internet, more conversations with people, more focus on your own method, something like that.
Yeah, just really briefly, do you have any thoughts on how these strategies may relate to, say, like mathematical creativity? Or whether that's something separate? It's actually not a topic I know much about. Like, I come from an engineering background. I was in algorithm development. I always felt like mathematical creativity was more difficult, but somehow different than these other types of problem solving.
Yeah, no, that's totally brilliant. And this is an area of total fascination for me. And I've actually had a bunch of conversations with mathematicians and also musicians about this, because actually musical creativity is probably closer in some ways to mathematical creativity than maybe these other kinds of creativity. And I think the answer is that a lot of mathematical creativity and also musical creativity engages more of these logic parts of the brain that I haven't been talking so much about. And, when you look at someone, I think Einstein is a good example. When you look at Einstein, he uses a narrative approach. So Einstein has all these kind of wacky thought experiments where he imagines himself running with a light beam, or he imagines himself being in an elevator that's like falling through infinite space and things like that. And that allows him to have the big insight that he then uses the math to fill in the pieces. And so usually I think a lot of these mathematical breakthroughs may involve some of the mechanisms that I'm talking about, but I also think a ton of it really is this kind of logical creativity and kind of mixing around things until it kind of feels right or it fits and things like that. But the honest truth is, I don't work with a lot of mathematicians. I mostly work with special forces and third graders.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question. I teach MBA students. I'm from the business school. Believe it or not, we're interested in creativity. And particularly in the area, you talked about resilience. One of the things we run into, and we're probably dealing with the problem at an end that maybe your special forces people are at that end as well. Number of years of experience and so on. And individuals who have developed their analytic minds. So they're very good at hypodeduction, but not holistic induction. And one of the things we're trying to do is to deconstruct, so to speak, how they attack a problem or go after a problem. A lot of what they're interested in is the efficiency of coming up with an answer as quickly as possible, rather than stepping back. And I think the question that came from back here, and what your response was around empathy and the importance of empathy. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about empathy as a tool in the resilience package and the importance of it.
Yeah, totally. So first of all, I work a ton now with our business school at Ohio State, and obviously with Booth and with Wharton too. And this is a real thing for me because a lot of business people are very creative, but they also have these huge financial pressures, which makes them extremely impatient.
Exactly.
And they just want everything to happen now. And you have to go through this complicated process with them where you say, look, you have to find an answer that is sustainable in 2 years. Finding a kind of quick fix now that breaks is not going to help you that much. You know, you want to find something, and that often takes a little bit of time, and you have to kind of invest in that. And to your point about empathy, first of all, leaders who are able to surround themselves with people who think really differently from them and who are able to listen to those people just tend to get better results because you don't have all the ideas in your own head. If you did, you would know the answers already. So that's the kind of need to have a diverse team in a kind of deep core sense of bringing in people who might make you uncomfortable, who might challenge your authority, who might say something in the room that makes you look like an idiot, and being okay with that. Like, you have to develop that level of courage and confidence as a leader that you will build those really inclusive spaces. And what we have found is that both in special operations and in companies, the leaders that are most able to come up with creative answers are the ones that ask the most questions that they don't know the answer to. So what I mean by that is leaders who spend a lot of time asking questions that they think they already know the answer to, which is a surprisingly high number of leaders I have discovered. That, you know, they will ask, like, why did you do that? And they're like, I already know the answer because you're an idiot. You know what I mean? Or something like that. You know what I mean? But they'll already have kind of formed an opinion. But if they're like, why did you do that? And they really want to know why you did that, that curiosity builds a deep empathy. It's not an emotional empathy, but it's what we would call a kind of more cognitive empathy, where you start to be able to see the other person's perspective and then anticipate what they might do in a kind of circumstance. And then what that is doing is that's growing your counterfactual space. So the big thing that I say to these leaders is when we run studies on these guys, we find that over 95% of the kind of things that business people think are the future are a reflection of one of their hopes or their fears. So if you ask almost any business leader out there, what's going to happen in the next 3 years, you can trace it back to something they're afraid is going to happen or something they wish is going to happen. And it turns out, are 95% of the things that happen in the future one of our hopes or fears? No. In fact, significantly less than that. In fact, almost no percent of the things that we hope or fear come true, you know? And so the big value of empathy that we sell them on is that the more you're thinking like somebody else, the more you're forgetting your own hopes and fears in the moments, and that just opens up your own brain space. And that allows you to see things. And that usually calms them down because then you're telling them it's actually coming from your own brain, which I think in a lot of them is the problem, not just the efficiency problem, but a lot of them really want to have ownership of the answer in a kind of core way. So I hope that helps on a basic level, but it basically just comes down to asking questions you don't know the answer to and developing that kind of genuine curiosity, and then that will naturally lead you to surround yourself with a more diverse team, which will come up with more diverse answers. And then at the end of the day, you just have to be the person who does the judgment call about the efficiency. But you can't put that in at the beginning. You have to be the person at the end who's like, we don't have the resources to try that now. Or more, what I like to encourage them to do is what I would call multiple prototyping, where they push out 2 or 3 ideas at the same time with a short horizon to start to map the possibility space. And then when you do that, you start to very quickly see, oh, there's a lot of ground to be gained here, or all 3 prototypes are kind of converging on the same outcome, or whatever. That process tends to be more fruitful, and most businesses will do something similar to that if they're effective.
That's helpful, Angus.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just adding a comment, you had design thinking as one of the tools, that people try. And my feeling is they don't spend enough time on the empathy stage, the first stage. They go very quickly to a solution. Yeah. And the more, what we see in our research is the more time people spend in the empathy stage, the better the ideas are at the other end.
I would believe that. The one thing I want to say, and again, you can push back on this, is that when you ask these teams to empathize, what they're really doing is they're imagining a universal client or customer who's using the product. So, they're saying, what do I imagine is the kind of archetypal user for this, And what that does is that immediately universalizes. And so it's a very specific kind of empathy, which is really the kind of empathy that a computer would have. Whereas a real empathy that humans have for each other is a different person would use this fork differently in every situation. And I like to encourage the people I work with to have that human empathy first, not to start with the product and then find an ideal consumer, but just be like, who's your weirdest consumer? What would a 4-year-old do with this? Let's actually start to get outside of this idea that there's a universal ideal customer or clients and get into the space, because design thinking, as effective as it really is at getting stuff to market, really does take these kind of faster roads,
Giving them permission to reframe the challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask the last question.
Yeah.
Right back to AI, because Angus has to leave at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, I do. Get on the phone.
I want to bring you back to AI and this brilliant article you wrote in Wired. Can I read from it?
Oh, yeah, sure. Of course. Feel free to quote me. Absolutely.
So it's called Optimizing Machines as Parallels, Consider Creatively Adequate AI. That one. And I'm just going to read the first 2 lines, and I just want you to comment what you think the dangers of AI are. Societally, the way we think creatively, think of ourselves as, empowered,
Yes.
able-minded,
Yes.
people. So, because everywhere AI is breaking, and everywhere it's breaking us. The breaking ensues whenever AI encounters ambiguity or volatility. And in a hazy, unstable world, that's all the time. Either the data can be interpreted another way or it's obsolesced by new events, at which point AI finds itself looking at life through errant eyes, seeing left as right or of now as yesterday. Yet because AI lacks self-awareness, it doesn't realize that its worldview has cracked. So on it whirs, unwittingly transmitting the fracture to all things plugged into it. Cars are crashed, insults are hurled, allies are auto-targeted. This breaks humans in the direct sense of harming, even killing us. But it has also begun breaking us in a more subtle way. AI can now function at the mildest hint of data slip, so its architects are doing all they can to dampen ambiguity and volatility. And since the world's primary source of ambiguity and volatility is humans, we have found ourselves aggressively stifled. We've been forced into metric assessments at schools, standard flow patterns at work, and regularized sets at hospitals, gyms, and social media hangouts. In the process, we've lost large chunks of our independence, creativity, and daring that our biology evolved to keep us resilient, making us more angry, anxious, and burnt out. If we want a better future, we need to pursue a different remedy to AI's mental fragility. Instead of remaking ourselves in AI's brittle image, we should do the opposite. We should remake AI in the image of our anti-fragility. So I just want to talk a little bit about this wonderful kind of piece that you wrote, and where what spurred you to write it, and where you think big dangers lie, please.
That and more.
Yeah, so, and if anyone is an AI hater, again, feel free to email me. This all came about because I just got asked to do a lot of work with AI companies to solve problems, and I didn't really understand how AI works until I got into it, and then I started to understand the software, and then I started to understand the hardware, and then I started to understand all this kind of stuff. And the first part of how AI is harming us is that things like Tesla autopilot. It's like, oh, this car is as smart as I am, and then it's not. And it kills things, you know. And then it's like, oh, it just needs more data. No, it doesn't, you know. We've tried replacing doctors with AI with catastrophic results. There's all of these problems. So in this immediate sense, there's this problem that when we ask AI to solve our problems for us, it not only does not, but it harms us. But then the bigger problem, I think, is that we have this idea in our head that the way AI thinks is true intelligence. And if the way that AI thinks is true intelligence, then we should all be thinking more like AI. So we should be building schools that teach our kids to think more like AI. We should be having workplaces that function more like a computer. We should be doing all these things because clearly that is real intelligence. And that's how we're going to solve all the world's problems. This, to me, is a giant fail because AI is based on the idea of optimization. And optimization is this idea that you perfect an answer to a problem, which is great in any situation in which nothing ever changes, which is no situation. Because the moment that something changes, your optimized answer has become fragile, and it breaks. And really, humans have survived by not being optimized. We're not very optimized. We're okay. We're good enough. And in general, there's this myth about Darwinian evolution that it's survival of the fittest. It's not. It's survival of the adequate. And so the opposite of fragility is resilience or even anti-fragility. And that comes from not seeking optimization, but seeking flexibility and good enough. And so what I was talking about in that article is, first of all, that we need to back off from treating kids as though they need to be turned into computers, and we need to make schools that have more of the stuff that I've been talking about, but you know, any kind of stuff that encourages resilience and complexity and all these kinds of things, non-optimization. But then also it means that we need to rethink what AI is doing. Because, you know, sitting and pointing the finger at AI and being like, well, AI is bad and all these kinds of things, I mean, if we follow that road too far, we're going to basically end up in a kind of weird romanticism, you know, like a kind of classic romanticism, or a kind of like weird humans are just better, kill the machines kind of Luddite thing. And it's like, no, AI is a really powerful tool. We built it. It can solve problems. Let's figure out how to make it better. And so this is actually, I mean, the AI startup that I'm doing now, weirdly enough, is on this. I won't bore you guys with the details of the actual AI startup. But the idea basically is to say, well, like, can we take the fact that AI is smart in a way that we're not? Instead of thinking that AI is universally smart, let's say AI is really smart in a way that's different from humans. And then let's say, well, let's pair that different intelligence with our intelligence. Because ultimately what makes more effective societies is when people are different from each other. And we can think of AI as a different kind of thing, a different intelligence. And that's what makes it valuable. And it's a friend, it's a partner. It's not a replacement or a god. And so I think the future of AI, and this is kind of some of the stuff we've done in special ops, is to say, how can we anticipate what its problems are going to be, because we're humans? And how can we protect it from those problems? And how can we build it in ways such that we pull it out when it's experiencing those problems? So a very simple example of this, and then I'll shut up, is hedge fund trading. I'm not a big fan of hedge fund trading, but I got pulled into this universe because they have money to support my crazy research. So what do hedge fund traders do? They invest money in markets. When a market is really, really stable, in a historical sense, do you want a human investing in that market or an AI? You want an AI. Because any situation that's really stable, let the AI do it. They're going to make much faster, much more efficient decisions. The moment that market becomes volatile, do you want the AI making decisions? No, you want to pull it out, you want to put a human trader in. And it's the same thing with any situation. If it's a stable situation, which is following the same rules that you followed yesterday, and that you have a lot of data on, in other words, it's a transparent and data-rich environment, the AI, we should listen to it. The moment that it becomes murky or volatile, turn it over to a human. And have this kind of back and forth kind of trade-off approach. So that's sort of what I talk about in the article, is that sense that we should partner with AI, We shouldn't look at it to save us from ourselves, but neither should we burn it and destroy it as a false god.
It's not burn and destroy. Thank you so much, Angus.
Thank you, guys.